This is the 31st video supplement for CIS 351, Grand Valley State University's course on computer organization and assembly language. The previous video shows how a new machine instruction is supplied by RAM at the beginning of each clock cycle. But that leaves two questions. One, how are these machine instructions generated in the first place? And two, how do they get into RAM? In theory, we could generate machine code by simply typing it out. For example, if we wanted to add registers 2 and 3 together and put the result in register 1, we could open a text editor like VI or Emacs and enter the corresponding 1s and 0s. It'd probably be better to enter this as a hex value. But in either case, the process would obviously be tedious and error-prone. Even worse, imagine trying to read, edit, and debug code that looked like this. Or even worse, this. Fortunately, as you can see here, simply representing each machine language field in a human-readable form makes for a reasonably usable language that we call assembly. Now, just as each type of CPU has its own machine language, each CPU also has its own assembly language, but in general, the idea is that programmers write lines of code that correspond directly to individual machine instructions, then a program called an assembler converts those instructions into machine code. Assembly is a clear improvement over working with machine code directly, but as you'll soon discover, it isn't exactly easy. The difficulties can perhaps be summarized most concisely by pointing out that the CPU simply doesn't think about problems the same way that most humans do. High-level languages like Fortran and C are more expressive and much easier to use, mainly because they let us think about problems and express solutions in a way that's more natural for us. These languages came into use as soon as computers became sufficiently powerful enough to process them. All right, so back to the original question. Where does machine code come from? No. Today, for the most part, the process begins when a program is written in a high-level language. If that language is a compiled language, like C, C++, Fortran, Ada, Rust, then the next step is to run a program called the compiler, which transforms the source code into assembly. Compilation in and of itself is a very complex and fascinating process. You should consider taking a course on it. If you do take such a course, you'll understand why it took a few years for the first compilers to come out, and why it took decades before most performance-critical sections of code no longer needed to be optimized by hand. Anyway, after the compiler generates assembly, the assembler, which is often bundled into the compiler, converts the assembly to machine code and saves the sequence of machine instructions into a file. The actual process is considerably more complicated. For example, this slide here ignores the fact that we typically write source code in multiple files and have to merge them together, and that when we produce programs, we also bring in shared code produced elsewhere. But all of that is a discussion for another day. For our purposes right now, it's sufficient to think of an executable file, like an exe file in Windows, as simply a long list of machine instructions. So now that we have this list of machine code in a file, how does it get into RAM so we can execute it? Well, that's the job of the operating system. We could, of course, spend an entire semester talking about operating systems, and actually here at Grand Valley you don't exactly have a choice. Operating systems is a required course. But for our purposes right now, an operating system has two main jobs. First, it acts as your computer's traffic cop. It arbitrates access to the hardware, so, for example, when you have multiple programs open, the stuff you type on the keyboard goes to the right program. Another part of this traffic cop role is to enforce security, like preventing you from accessing another user's files. Second, the operating system provides the user interface to the computer as a whole. For example, when you want to launch a program or move a file, you ask the operating system to do it for you. So let's say, for example, you want to launch Chrome. Somewhere on your hard disk is a file named something like Chrome or Chrome.exe that contains a sequence of machine instructions. In Windows, when you double-click on the Chrome icon, your window manager tells the operating system that you want to execute the code inside of Chrome.exe. Or if you're running Linux and type Chrome at the terminal, then Bash, or whatever your shell is, tells the operating system that you want to execute the code in the file named Chrome. The operating system then begins reading the data from the disk and storing it in RAM. When all the instructions have been loaded, it places the address of the first instruction in the program counter, which causes the computer to start running the program. So like I said, this video leaves out a lot of interesting details about compiling, linking, and loading programs. The goal here is to provide just enough detail so that the generation of machine code and the launching of programs doesn't feel like magic. Many of these details will be covered in your programming languages and operating systems courses. But if you want to know more now, feel free to ask either in class or office hours. Just be warned that I'm a shameless computer nerd and you may get a far longer explanation than you intended. In the next video, we'll take a look at some of the other features of assembly language and how to use the Mars simulator.